I thought I was having a nightmare when I woke up at exactly 2:17 a.m. on that freezing February night in Montana and saw a small figure standing motionless in my backyard, surrounded by 3 feet of fresh snow. But when I realized it was my 6-year-old grandson Tommy, barefoot and wearing nothing but his thin Superman pajamas in -15-degree weather, my heart started pounding so hard I thought I was having a heart attack. And when I ran outside and scooped his tiny, ice-cold body into my arms, what he whispered in my ear made my blood freeze colder than the Montana winter air around us. "Grandma, Daddy hurt Mommy really bad this time. She won't wake up." In that moment, I knew that the nightmare I'd been dreading for 3 years had finally become reality, and that this innocent little boy had witnessed something that would change all of our lives forever. But what I didn't know was that the next 72 hours would test everything I believed about justice, family, and how far a grandmother would go to protect the child she loves more than her own life. My name is Margaret Walsh, I'm 58 years old, and I've lived in the same small town of Whitefish, Montana, for my entire life, where the population is barely 8,000 people and everyone knows everyone else's business. I raised 3 children as a single mother after my husband died in a logging accident when I was 29, working double shifts at the local diner and cleaning offices at night to make ends meet. My oldest son Michael became a teacher, my daughter Sarah moved to Seattle and became a nurse, and my youngest son David, well, David became the cross I would have to bear for the rest of my life. David was always different from his siblings. Where Michael was gentle and studious, David was angry and impulsive. Where Sarah was nurturing and kind, David was selfish and demanding. By the time he was 16, he was drinking beer with older boys, getting into fights at school, and coming home with bloody knuckles and stories that never quite made sense. I tried everything I could think of. Therapy, military school, tough love, unconditional love, but nothing seemed to reach the rage that was eating him alive from the inside. When David turned 21, he was working construction jobs sporadically, drinking heavily on weekends, and dating a series of young women who would inevitably break up with him after a few months. I always wondered what happened in those relationships that made these girls disappear so quickly. But David would just shrug and say they couldn't handle a real man. Looking back now, I realize I should have asked more questions, should have paid attention to the pattern, should have seen the warning signs that were screaming at me in languages I didn't want to understand. Then David met Lisa Patterson, a sweet 20-year-old girl who worked at the local Walmart and lived with her elderly grandmother on the other side of town. Lisa was tiny, barely 5'2", with long brown hair and big green eyes that always seemed a little scared, even when she was smiling. She was quiet and polite, the kind of girl who apologized for everything and never asked for anything. David seemed to calm down when he was with her, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope that maybe love could heal whatever was broken inside my son. They started dating in 2018, and within 6 months, Lisa was pregnant. David surprised everyone by proposing to her immediately, insisting that he wanted to do the right thing and be a good father. The wedding was small, held in the backyard of Lisa's grandmother's house, with maybe 30 people in attendance. I watched Lisa walking down that makeshift aisle in a simple white dress from JCPenney, and I thought she looked more terrified than happy, but I told myself it was just normal wedding nerves. Tommy was born in March 2019, a beautiful baby with David's dark hair and Lisa's green eyes. David seemed genuinely excited about being a father, showing up at the hospital with flowers and promising Lisa that he was going to be the kind of dad he'd never had. For the first few months, it actually seemed like parenthood had changed him. He worked more consistently, drank less, and would spend hours holding Tommy and talking about all the things he was going to teach his son. But by the time Tommy was walking, the cracks were starting to show. I lived in a duplex on Elm Street, and when the unit next to mine became available, I suggested that David and Lisa rent it so I could help with the baby and they could save money. It seemed like a perfect arrangement. They'd have their privacy, but I'd be right there if they needed anything. What I didn't anticipate was that living so close would give me a front-row seat to the slow-motion disaster that my son's marriage was becoming. It started with small things that I tried to convince myself were normal relationship tensions. I'd hear raised voices through the thin walls late at night, doors slamming, David's truck peeling out of the driveway at all hours. When I'd see Lisa the next day, she'd be quiet and jumpy, making excuses about why she looked tired or why she had a bruise on her arm. "I'm so clumsy," she'd say with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. I walked into the kitchen cabinet again. But kitchen cabinets don't leave fingerprint-shaped bruises on someone's upper arm. I started paying closer attention, and what I saw made my stomach turn. Lisa would flinch whenever David raised his voice, even when he wasn't talking to her. She'd position herself between David and Tommy whenever David seemed agitated, as if she was shielding the baby from something. She stopped making eye contact with me when we talked, and she started wearing long sleeves even in the summer heat. When Tommy was 2 years old, I confronted Lisa directly. I invited her over for coffee one morning when David was at work, and I asked her point-blank if my son was hurting her. She broke down crying immediately, but then she begged me not to say anything to David, not to call the police, not to get involved. She insisted that David was just under a lot of stress with work and money, that he was trying to be better, that she could handle it. "He's not a bad person, Margaret," she said through her tears. "He's just struggling, and he loves Tommy so much. I can't break up our family over some arguments that got out of hand." I wanted to shake her, to tell her that what she was describing wasn't arguments, it was abuse. But Lisa was an adult, and I couldn't force her to leave her husband or report him to the police. All I could do was make sure she knew that my door was always open, that she and Tommy could come to me anytime, day or night, if they needed help. But I also started documenting everything I saw and heard. Every time Lisa showed up with unexplained injuries, every time I heard shouting and crying through the walls, every time Tommy seemed unusually quiet or clingy after spending time with his father, I kept a journal with dates and descriptions, took pictures when Lisa would let me, and prayed that I would never have to use any of it. David's drinking got progressively worse as Tommy got older. He'd come home from work and start drinking beer immediately, sometimes polishing off a 12-pack before dinner. On weekends he'd add whiskey to the mix, and that's when the real violence would start. I'd hear Lisa pleading with him to stop, Tommy crying in his bedroom, furniture being thrown around. But every time I called over to check on them, Lisa would answer the phone in a shaky voice and insist everything was fine. The worst part was watching Tommy grow up in that environment. By the time he was 4 years old, he was exhibiting signs of trauma that broke my heart. He was hypervigilant, always scanning adults' faces to gauge their moods. He startled easily at loud noises. He had frequent nightmares and would wet the bed when things were particularly bad next door. He was unusually mature for his age, trying to comfort his mother when she was crying, trying to distract his father when he was getting angry. Tommy spent more and more time at my house, which I encouraged. I wanted to give him at least one place where he could feel safe and be a normal little boy. We'd bake cookies together, read stories, watch cartoons, and play games that helped him forget about the chaos in his own home. But every evening, he'd have to go back next door, and I'd watch his little shoulders tense up as he walked across the yard to a house that should have been his sanctuary but had become his prison. I tried talking to David multiple times about his drinking and his treatment of Lisa, but he would fly into a rage whenever I brought it up. "Mind your own business, Mom," he'd say. "I don't tell you how to live your life, so don't tell me how to live mine. Lisa is my wife, and what happens in my house is between me and her." But Tommy was my grandson, and I couldn't just mind my own business when it came to his safety and well-being. The breaking point came on a Friday night in February. David had been laid off from his construction job the week before, and he'd been drinking heavily every day since then. Lisa had picked up extra shifts at Walmart to try to cover their bills, which meant she was getting home late and exhausted every night. David resented having to watch Tommy while she worked, and I could hear him complaining loudly about being stuck with babysitting duty, while his wife was out, flirting with other men at work. That Friday night, I heard David come home around 11 p.m., and I could tell from the way his truck door slammed and the way he was stumbling up the front steps that he was drunker than usual. Lisa's car wasn't in the driveway yet, which meant she was working the late shift and wouldn't be home until after midnight. I heard David banging around in the kitchen, the refrigerator opening and closing repeatedly, cabinet doors slamming. Then I heard Tommy crying, and David yelling at him to shut up and go to sleep. The crying continued, getting louder and more desperate, and David's voice got angrier and angrier. I said, "Shut up. Your mommy's not here to baby you, so you better toughen up right now." I heard footsteps stomping up the stairs, Tommy's door slamming, then more crying. Part of me wanted to go over there, but I'd learned from experience that interfering when David was drunk only made things worse for Lisa and Tommy later. So I did what I'd been doing for months. I sat in my living room, listening helplessly to the sounds of my grandson's terror, and prayed that Lisa would come home soon. Lisa's car finally pulled into the driveway around 12:30 a.m. I watched through my window as she walked slowly to the front door, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She worked 10-hour shifts on her feet, dealing with difficult customers and a demanding manager, all for barely above minimum wage. The last thing she should have had to come home to was a drunk husband and a traumatized child. But that's exactly what she found. I heard David start yelling the moment she walked through the door. He was slurring his words, but I could make out accusations about her being late, about her probably cheating on him with her coworkers, about her being a terrible mother for leaving Tommy with him all evening. Lisa's voice was too quiet for me to hear her responses, but I could tell she was trying to calm him down, trying to de-escalate the situation the way she'd learned to do over years of walking on eggshells. But David was too drunk and too angry to be calmed down. The shouting got louder and more vicious. I heard something crash, probably a lamp or a picture frame. Lisa's voice got higher and more panicked. Tommy started crying again upstairs, calling for his mommy. And then I heard the sound that I'd been dreading for years. The unmistakable sound of flesh hitting flesh, followed by Lisa's scream. I was already reaching for my phone to call 911 when everything went quiet. Not the normal quiet of people going to bed, but the terrible, unnatural quiet of something being very, very wrong. I waited for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. No more voices, no more crying, no sounds of movement at all. David's truck was still in the driveway, and Lisa's car was there too, but the house might as well have been empty for all the noise it was making. I tried to convince myself that maybe they'd finally gone to bed, that maybe David had passed out and Lisa was just trying not to wake him up. But something in my gut told me that this time was different, that the silence next door wasn't peaceful, it was ominous. I must have finally fallen asleep around 3 a.m., because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in my recliner with a terrible feeling in my chest, like something was pressing down on my lungs and making it hard to breathe. The house next door was still completely silent, and David's truck was still in the driveway, but something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I got up to get a glass of water and happened to glance out my kitchen window into the backyard. That's when I saw him. Tommy was standing in the middle of my backyard, perfectly still, like a little statue in the moonlight. He was wearing his Superman pajamas, the thin cotton ones that Lisa had bought him for Christmas, and he was barefoot in snow that came up to his knees. He wasn't shivering, wasn't moving, wasn't crying. He was just standing there, staring at my house with an expression on his 6-year-old face that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I didn't stop to put on shoes or a coat. I ran outside in my nightgown and scooped him up in my arms, feeling how ice-cold his little body was, how his lips were turning blue, how his feet were like blocks of ice. He should have had frostbite. He should have been hypothermic. The fact that he was still conscious was a miracle. I carried him inside and wrapped him in blankets, rubbing his hands and feet to get the circulation going. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with those big green eyes that looked decades older than they should have. I made him hot chocolate and drew him a warm bath, and only when he was finally warming up did I dare to ask him what had happened. "Tommy, sweetheart, what were you doing outside? How did you get out of your house?" That's when he looked at me with those eyes that had seen too much, and whispered the words that changed everything. "Grandma, Daddy hurt Mommy really bad this time. She won't wake up." My blood turned to ice water. "What do you mean she won't wake up, baby? She's sleeping on the floor, and there's red stuff in her hair, and I tried to shake her but she won't wake up. Daddy's sleeping too, but he's making loud noises." I knew I had to call 911, but I also knew I had to see for myself what had happened next door. I couldn't leave Tommy alone, so I bundled him up in more blankets and told him we were going to go check on his mommy together. I used my spare key to David's house, the one Lisa had given me years ago for emergencies. The front door was unlocked anyway, hanging slightly open like David had been too drunk to close it properly. The house smelled like beer and something metallic that made my stomach lurch. I found Lisa in the living room, exactly as Tommy had described. She was lying on her side next to the coffee table, unconscious, with blood matted in her hair and more blood pooled on the carpet beneath her head. Her face was swollen and bruised, her breathing was shallow and labored, and when I felt for her pulse, it was weak and irregular. David was passed out on the couch, snoring loudly, an empty bottle of Jack Daniels on the floor beside him. His knuckles were split and bloody. I called 911 immediately, reporting a domestic violence incident and requesting both police and an ambulance. Then I called my daughter Sarah in Seattle, waking her up at 4 a.m. to tell her that I needed her to come home immediately because something terrible had happened and I was going to need help taking care of Tommy. Before you think this story has a quick and simple resolution, let me tell you that dealing with domestic violence is never quick and never simple. Drop the word justice in the comments if you think David should have gone to prison for what he did to Lisa. And make sure you're subscribed because what happened next will show you just how broken our legal system really is. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, followed closely by 2 police officers who looked like they were barely old enough to drink legally. Lisa was unconscious and unresponsive, with obvious signs of severe head trauma. They loaded her into the ambulance and rushed her to Kalispell Regional Medical Center, 40 minutes away, while one of the officers stayed behind to arrest David. David woke up when the officer started handcuffing him, and his first reaction wasn't concern for his wife or his son, it was anger at being disturbed. "What the hell is going on?" he slurred, still drunk enough that he was swaying even while sitting down. "Why are you arresting me? This is my house." "Sir, your wife has been severely beaten and is being transported to the hospital with life-threatening injuries," Officer Martinez explained. "You're being arrested on suspicion of domestic violence and aggravated assault." David's response chilled me to the bone. "She probably fell down the stairs," he said with a shrug. "Lisa's always been clumsy. Ask anyone." But Tommy was sitting right there, wrapped in blankets on my lap, and he spoke up in his small, clear voice. "Mommy didn't fall down, Daddy. You hit her with your hands and she fell down, and then you hit her more when she was on the floor." David's face went white, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the full scope of what had happened. He looked at Tommy, then at me, then at the blood on the carpet, and I watched the reality of his actions crash over him like a wave. "Tommy, you don't know what you saw," he said, his voice getting desperate. "Daddy was trying to help Mommy. She fell and Daddy was trying to wake her up." But Tommy had been watching his parents' relationship for his entire 6 years of life, and he knew the difference between helping and hurting. "No, Daddy. You were making angry noises and you hurt Mommy, and then she wouldn't get up anymore." The officer took detailed statements from both Tommy and me, photographed David's bloody knuckles and the crime scene, and then transported David to the county jail. Before they left, David looked directly at me and said something that made my blood run cold. "This is all your fault, Mom. If you hadn't called the cops, everything would have been fine. Lisa will be fine. And now you've destroyed our family for nothing. I hope you're happy." The implication was clear. If Lisa survived, if she woke up and remembered what happened, if she decided to press charges, David would blame me for everything that followed. And if she didn't survive, he'd blame me for that too. I packed a bag for Tommy and drove to the hospital in Kalispell, where Lisa was undergoing emergency surgery for a traumatic brain injury. The doctors told me that she had a skull fracture, brain swelling, and internal bleeding. She might not survive the surgery, and if she did, there was no way to predict what kind of permanent damage she might have. Tommy and I spent the next 3 days in the hospital waiting room, sleeping on uncomfortable chairs and surviving on vending machine food, and the kindness of nurses who took pity on a grandmother trying to explain to a 6-year-old why his mommy might never wake up. Sarah drove from Seattle and took time off work to help me, and together we tried to create some sense of normalcy for Tommy, while his entire world was falling apart. David was released on bail after 48 hours, which meant he was free to walk around town while his wife fought for her life in the ICU. The judge had issued a restraining order preventing him from contacting Lisa or Tommy, but restraining orders are just pieces of paper, and David had never been good at following rules. Lisa survived the surgery, but she remained in a coma for 5 days. When she finally woke up, she was confused and disoriented, with significant memory problems and difficulty speaking. The doctors explained that she had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury that would likely cause permanent cognitive and physical disabilities. She might recover some of her functions with intensive therapy, but she would never be the same person she was before David beat her nearly to death. The worst part was that when Lisa was lucid enough to answer questions, she couldn't remember what had happened the night of the assault. She knew she was in the hospital, she knew she had been hurt, but she had no recollection of David attacking her. Without her testimony, the prosecutor's case would rely entirely on Tommy's eyewitness account and the physical evidence. But here's where the story gets really infuriating. David hired a lawyer, a slick-talking man from Billings who specialized in defending domestic violence cases. This lawyer's strategy was simple and despicable. Discredit the testimony of a 6-year-old boy and paint Lisa's injuries as the result of an accidental fall. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lawyer said during opening statements, "children are unreliable witnesses. They confuse dreams with reality, they misinterpret what they see, and they can be easily influenced by adults who have their own agendas. Tommy Walsh is a traumatized little boy who loves his grandmother very much, and it's entirely possible that his grandmother has inadvertently coached him to believe that his father deliberately hurt his mother, when in fact what happened was a tragic accident." I wanted to stand up and scream. Tommy hadn't been coached by anyone. Tommy had lived with violence his entire life, and he knew the difference between helping and hurting, between accidents and deliberate attacks. But the jury was looking at this sweet-faced 6-year-old boy and wondering if his testimony could really be trusted. The defense lawyer also argued that Lisa's injuries were consistent with falling downstairs, despite the fact that there were no stairs in the living room where she was found. He suggested that David's bloody knuckles came from trying to help Lisa after she fell, not from beating her. He painted David as a devoted husband and father who was being persecuted by a vindictive mother-in-law who had never liked him. The trial lasted 2 weeks, during which I had to listen to David's friends and coworkers testify about what a good guy he was, how he'd never hurt a fly, how he loved his wife and son more than anything in the world. I had to watch the defense lawyer treat Tommy like he was lying or confused when Tommy took the stand and clearly, calmly described watching his father beat his mother unconscious. And I had to sit there while David himself took the stand and denied everything, claiming that he barely remembered that night because he was so drunk, but he was sure he would never hurt Lisa because he loved her too much. "I've made mistakes," David said, tears streaming down his face in what I'm sure the jury thought was genuine remorse. "I've struggled with alcohol, and I know that's affected my family, but I would never ever hurt my wife. Lisa is the love of my life, and Tommy is my whole world. The idea that I could have deliberately hurt either of them is unthinkable." It was a masterful performance, and I could see several jurors nodding sympathetically. Here was a man who admitted to his flaws, who seemed genuinely devastated by his wife's condition, who appeared to be nothing more than a victim of circumstances and an overzealous prosecution. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before coming back with a verdict: guilty of aggravated assault, but not attempted murder. David was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months for good behavior. 3 years. For beating his wife nearly to death. For traumatizing his son. For destroying a family and leaving a young woman with permanent disabilities that would affect her for the rest of her life. I sat in that courtroom and listened to the judge explain that David would be eligible for supervised visitation with Tommy once he was released from prison, because despite his conviction, he was still Tommy's father and had parental rights that could not be terminated unless there was evidence of ongoing danger to the child. That night I held Tommy while he cried and asked me why his daddy was coming back, why the judge didn't understand that his daddy hurt people, why nobody was listening to him when he told them what really happened. I didn't have good answers for any of his questions. David went to prison in June, and I applied for temporary custody of Tommy while Lisa recovered from her injuries. Lisa spent 3 months in rehabilitation, learning to walk again, learning to speak clearly, working on cognitive exercises to help with her memory problems. She would never be the same person she was before, but with intensive therapy she was able to function independently, though she would always struggle with short-term memory, concentration, and processing complex information. When Lisa was released from rehab, she moved into a small apartment in town with assistance from social services. She loved Tommy desperately and wanted to be part of his life, but she knew she couldn't provide the stable, consistent care that a 6-year-old needed. We worked out an arrangement where Tommy would stay with me during the week and spend weekends with Lisa, when she felt up to it. For almost 2 years our lives settled into a new normal. Tommy started seeing a child psychologist to help him process the trauma he'd experienced, and slowly, he began to heal. He was still hypervigilant and easily startled, but he started sleeping through the night again. He stopped wetting the bed. He began to trust that the adults in his life would keep him safe. Lisa's visits became more regular and more meaningful as she continued to recover. She couldn't remember a lot of details from Tommy's early childhood, but she was determined to be the best mother she could be moving forward. She took parenting classes, learned strategies for managing her cognitive limitations, and never missed a visit with her son. And Tommy thrived. He did well in school, made friends, joined Little League Baseball, and seemed like a normal, happy kid most of the time. There were still moments when he would get quiet and withdrawn, usually around the anniversary of the assault or when other kids talked about their fathers, but overall he was healing. Then in March I got the phone call I'd been dreading. David was being released from prison early for good behavior. The nightmare was starting all over again. Now here's the part of the story that will make you understand why our legal system is so broken when it comes to protecting children from abusive parents. Despite David's conviction for nearly killing Tommy's mother, despite Tommy's testimony about the violence he witnessed, despite the restraining order that was still technically in effect, David's parental rights had never been terminated. According to the family court judge, David had paid his debt to society by serving 22 months in prison, and he was entitled to supervised visitation with his son to begin rebuilding their relationship. The court appointed a social worker to oversee these visits, but David would be allowed to see Tommy for 4 hours every other weekend, with the possibility of unsupervised visits if the supervised visits went well. I hired a lawyer and fought this decision with everything I had. I presented evidence of Tommy's ongoing trauma, documentation of David's history of violence, testimony from Tommy's therapist about how the prospect of seeing his father was affecting his mental health. But the judge was unmoved. Mr. Walsh has completed his sentence and his court-mandated anger management classes, the judge said. He has a constitutional right to a relationship with his child, and Tommy has a right to know his father. The court believes that supervised visitation is an appropriate way to begin healing this family. Healing this family. As if there was any family left to heal. As if David hadn't destroyed everything worth saving when he beat Lisa unconscious in front of their 6-year-old son. The first supervised visit was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the Department of Social Services office. I drove Tommy to the appointment, feeling sick to my stomach as I watched him get smaller and quieter the closer we got to the building. By the time we parked, he was practically hyperventilating. "Grandma, I don't want to see him," Tommy whispered, his little hand gripping mine so tightly I thought he might break my fingers. "What if he's still angry? What if he hurts me like he hurt Mommy?" I knelt down to his eye level and looked directly into his scared green eyes. "Tommy, I promise you that your daddy cannot hurt you at this visit. There will be a nice lady from the state who will stay in the room the whole time. And if you feel scared or uncomfortable, you can tell her and the visit will end immediately. And I'll be right here in the waiting room the entire time. Okay?" But Tommy wasn't fooled by my reassurances. He knew that if the visits went well, he would eventually be expected to spend time alone with the man who had given him nightmares for 2 years. The social worker, a kind woman named Ms. Rodriguez, explained the rules to both David and Tommy. They would spend 2 hours together in a supervised playroom, engaging in appropriate activities while she observed and took notes. David was not allowed to discuss the night of the assault, was not allowed to say anything negative about me or Lisa, and was expected to focus entirely on rebuilding his relationship with his son. David had lost weight in prison and looked older than his 32 years. He was wearing clean clothes and had obviously made an effort to look presentable, but there was something in his eyes that made me uncomfortable, something calculating and cold that hadn't been there before he went to prison. When Tommy saw his father, he froze completely. All the color drained from his face, and he instinctively stepped behind me, trying to make himself invisible. "Hey there, buddy," David said in a voice that sounded forced and unnatural. "I've missed you so much. Do you want to come play some games with Daddy?" Tommy didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at David like he was seeing a ghost. Ms. Rodriguez gently encouraged Tommy to come into the playroom, explaining that she would be there the whole time and that he was safe. Eventually, Tommy allowed himself to be led into the room, but he sat as far away from David as possible and wouldn't make eye contact. I waited in the reception area for 2 hours, checking my watch every 5 minutes and straining to hear any sounds from the playroom. When the visit finally ended, Tommy ran out to me and immediately started crying. "He kept trying to touch me," Tommy sobbed. He wanted me to sit on his lap and hug him, but I didn't want to. And he kept saying he was sorry and that he loved me. But his voice sounded scary. Ms. Rodriguez confirmed that the visit had been challenging, but said that David had followed all the rules and hadn't done anything inappropriate. She recommended that visits continue on schedule, with the possibility of extending them to 4 hours if Tommy became more comfortable. But Tommy never became more comfortable. Visit after visit, he would beg me not to take him, would have panic attacks in the car on the way there, and would come out traumatized and withdrawn. His nightmares came back. He started wetting the bed again. His grades at school began to slip as he became unable to concentrate. David, meanwhile, was playing the system perfectly. He was punctual, polite, and followed all the rules during visits. He completed his court-mandated parenting classes and anger management program. He got a job at a local auto repair shop and rented a small apartment. On paper, he was a model ex-offender who was working hard to rebuild his life and reconnect with his son. But Tommy saw what the adults couldn't see, or didn't want to see. He saw the anger simmering underneath David's forced smiles. He heard the threat in David's voice when he talked about the people who kept us apart. He recognized the same dangerous energy that had terrified him for the first 6 years of his life. After 6 months of supervised visits, David's lawyer petitioned the court for unsupervised visitation, arguing that David had successfully demonstrated his commitment to being a good father, and that the supervised visits were no longer necessary. The social worker recommended approval, noting that David had never violated any of the visit rules and seemed genuinely invested in his relationship with Tommy. I fought this decision with everything I had, but the judge ruled in David's favor. Tommy would now be required to spend every other Saturday with his father, unsupervised, for 8 hours at a time. The night before Tommy's first unsupervised visit with David, he came to me with a request that broke my heart. "Grandma, if something bad happens when I'm with Daddy, and I can't call you, will you promise to come looking for me?" I promised him that I would always come looking for him, no matter what, but inside I was terrified. What if David's anger management classes hadn't worked? What if prison had made him more violent instead of less? What if he blamed Tommy for his incarceration and decided to take revenge? The first unsupervised visit went smoothly, at least on the surface. David picked Tommy up at 9 a.m. and brought him back at 5 p.m. as required. Tommy was quiet and withdrawn when he came home, but he said his father hadn't hurt him or yelled at him. They had gone to McDonald's and then to a movie, and David had bought him a new toy car. But over the following weeks and months, I noticed changes in Tommy that scared me. He became secretive and jumpy. He stopped talking about the visits even when I asked direct questions. He started having frequent stomachaches on the days he was scheduled to see David. And most troubling of all, he began making comments that sounded like things David had told him. "Grandma, Daddy says that Mommy, and you tell lies about him because you want to keep me away from him. Daddy says that what happened to Mommy was an accident, and it's not fair that he went to prison. Daddy says that when I'm older, I'll understand that he's not a bad person." I realized that David was using his visitation time to manipulate Tommy, to rewrite the history of what had happened, to convince an 8-year-old boy that his own memories and experiences were wrong. And there was nothing I could do to stop it, because David was following all the legal requirements of his visitation schedule. The breaking point came on a cold Saturday in December. David was supposed to bring Tommy home by 5 p.m., but 5 o'clock came and went with no sign of them. I called David's phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. I drove to his apartment, but his car wasn't there and nobody answered the door. By 7 p.m. I was panicking. I called the police, but they said that unless David had violated a specific court order, there wasn't much they could do. He was allowed to have Tommy for the entire day.